Together we're trying to learn how to make better decisions. If you're watching this video, you're probably smarter than the average bear. Unfortunately, being smart doesn't necessarily lead to good decision making. Why not? And what should you do about it? Let's start with an example. In 1959, Fidel Castro was sworn in as Prime Minister of Cuba. He started by building a lot of schools and hospitals in Cuba, but then started seizing American-owned land and businesses. Castro had major ideological differences with the USA. He implemented communist policies and suppressed free speech, the media, and any political opposition. As a result, the Americans wanted Castro gone. The National Security Council told the CIA to get rid of him, but to do it quietly, that is, without the world knowing it was the USA. The team came up with a cunning plan. They took about 1,400 Cuban exiles, gave them training, weapons, and painted planes that looked like the Cuban Air Force. They were going to sneak over and destroy Castro's plane and then start a popular uprising against Castro. This would neatly topple Castro's regime without anything obviously being done by the Americans. In 1961, the team that approved this plan was some of the best and brightest minds in the world. As US President Kennedy said, there were 50 or so of us, presumably the most experienced and smartest people we could get. Kennedy himself was a Harvard graduate. The National Security Advisor was a former Harvard dean. The rest of the team seemed like a brains trust of Ivy League graduates and Rhodes Scholars. But when talking about the operation, Kennedy said, 5 minutes after it began to fall in, we looked at each other and asked, how could we have been so stupid? The plan failed spectacularly. The Cuban intelligence had gotten wind of the invasion, so Castro was prepared when they arrived. He quickly captured or killed the exiles. Even if the exiles had succeeded in destroying Castro's planes, Castro's regime was much stronger and more popular than the US had anticipated. This fiasco has come to be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is one example that shows us that being smart doesn't necessarily lead to good decision making. Keith Stanovich is one of many decision-making researchers who have looked at the difference between intelligence and good decision-making. For example, let's look at confirmation bias, or my-side bias, or soldier mindset, whatever you want to call it. All of these describe the way we tend to ignore information that contradicts what we already think. To quote Stanovich's review of dozens of studies, evidence of my-side bias beliefs were rampant. Smokers were less likely to acknowledge the negative health effects of secondhand smoke. People who consumed relatively higher amounts of alcohol were less likely to acknowledge the health risks of alcohol consumption. People who were more highly religious were more likely to think that religiosity led to honesty. People who voted for George W. Bush were more likely to think that the invasion of Iraq made us safer from terrorists.
And to defend the world from grave danger.
All of these examples show how biased we are towards our own side of thinking. Now, Stanovich's team found that intelligence did not reduce the size of this bias. Those with higher cognitive abilities were no better at updating their beliefs in response to inconvenient or new evidence. In fact, in some cases, intelligence might be harmful. For example, Paul Klaczynski and his colleagues gave participants examples of experiments with flawed methods. Some of those experiments confirmed what participants already believed, and others contradicted their beliefs. Smarter participants weren't better at evaluating these studies fairly. In fact, they made stronger criticisms of the studies that disconfirmed their beliefs. They were softer on the bad studies that supported their beliefs. This is why I'm very happy to just accept the studies that show coffee is good for health. Ooh, here's a review of systematic reviews. 3 to 4 cups a day makes you live longer. Were those studies randomized? I don't know, I don't care. I mean, it's in the BMJ, one of the world's top journals. The way I'm living my life is right and perfect and supported by science. This is also why I'm incredibly skeptical of similar studies that say sugar is bad for health. What's this? Sugar leads to diabetes, cancer, blah, blah, blah. Isn't this all cross-sectional evidence? And look, even they say many of the studies were high risk of bias. The best evidence they've got is only level 2. Show me some level 1 evidence, then you can take away my cookies. BMJ, what fake news? I can notice this in myself. I find it much easier to share evidence that I like. I'm much more skeptical for something that's annoying or inconvenient. Coming back to the Bay of Pigs, a core component of what went wrong was this confirmation bias. The president and the CIA looked for information that supported their plan. They heard important warnings, but downplayed them. For example, the chair of the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee said the invasion violated international law, but either no one listened or no one cared. Confirmation bias had taken hold. These biases can get even worse when we're in groups. On top of confirmation bias, you get pressures of conformity. You've probably heard of the studies like these, where someone's in a room with a bunch of other students faced with a simple question. Which line is the same length as the line on the left? But everyone else in the room is an actor, told to give the incorrect answer of C. You can tell it's A, but do you really want to go against 5 other people who all agreed? I mean, you might end up on a group assignment with these people. You should wait until then to start a fight. So you think, maybe I'm not seeing it right, and they are. Multiple meta-analyses of over 100 studies show that people conform to group decisions even when they know the decision is wrong. Put these conformity effects together with confirmation bias, and you can end up with terrible decision making. The Bay of Pigs exemplified this so well it inspired a new word in psychology, groupthink. Those making decisions around the Bay of Pigs all said afterwards they had grave reservations. But when people reflect on the vibes in the room, they say, our meetings were taking place in a curious atmosphere of assumed consensus, and no one spoke against it. So if these are widespread biases, what can we do to overcome them so we can make better decisions? Well, some findings from these conformity studies are revealing. People are less likely to conform to the incorrect decision when there's at least one other person who's dissenting. This is the reason for what's called a red team or a devil's advocate. The idea of a red team also came from the Cold War. After the Bay of Pigs, the US government began implementing what they called red teaming, having a group of people formulate the strongest argument against the proposed decisions. A devil's advocate is the same idea. When the Catholic Church was considering someone for canonization as a saint, they'd have a devil's advocate, arguing against that person's canonization. The idea is that by really trying to argue against an idea, you can reveal things that might get you closer to the truth. If the CIA had tried red teaming the Bay of Pigs plan, they might have revealed the weaknesses before it was too late. For your projects or your writing, you might ask someone to red team your plans, or you could ask a large language model to do it for you, or you might try to act in that role yourself.
What if they spend it on alcohol or cigarettes?
One version of the same sort of idea is called a pre-mortem. The late Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on decision making, had described the pre-mortem as his favorite thinking tool. Now, we all know a post-mortem, when you review a death or a failure to try to figure out what went wrong. A pre-mortem does that in advance. Pretend this plan was a failure. Write the story of why it failed. This framing forces you to question your assumptions and identify some key assumptions that could be wrong. You might think planting trees will stop climate change, but assuming it doesn't, why doesn't it work? You might think your best career is in this new job, but assuming it wasn't, why didn't that work? You might think this intervention will work, but assuming it didn't, why did it fail? By doing this pre-mortem, you might get to avoid the post-mortem. If you're going to spend more than 3 weeks on a project or a decision, then you should almost certainly spend an hour trying to identify pitfalls before you fall into them. That's less than 1% of the project, but as we've seen, it can stop the whole thing falling over. This isn't the time where you're making a plan. It's time where you deliberately stop and try to pick apart the plan. Red team it, do a pre-mortem, or be a devil's advocate. Be the jerk that you want to see in the world. Be the person in the group project that grinds literally everything to a halt by questioning the very assumptions the project is built on. Okay, don't do that, but at least make a culture where it's safe to disagree. One way to promote that culture is to have someone just play the role of a devil's advocate for a little while. It all helps you overcome conformity and confirmation bias, to find where you might be wrong. As Mark Twain said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Fidel Castro wanted to deter the US from invading again. The Soviet Union helped Cuba secretly get a bunch of missiles that could hit the continental USA. They also helped Cuba acquire dozens of nuclear warheads. When a US spy plane found these missiles, President Kennedy needed to decide what to do. With the USA, the Soviets, and Cuba all holding nuclear missiles, the world held its breath. With hindsight, President Kennedy said he felt the odds of a nuclear war were between 1 in 3 and even. It's like flipping a coin. One of the things that got us through this crisis was Kennedy's improved decision-making. He attributes that, at least in part, to his devil's advocate. He learned from the Bay of Pigs, and he appointed his Attorney General to question every plan, doubt every decision, and challenge every assumption. By the end of the first day of meetings, the committee had seriously discussed 10 different alternatives. The US could not leave nuclear missiles on their doorstep, but if they invaded, it could be all-out nuclear war. In the end, Kennedy led the US's effort to de-escalate the tension, and Cuba removed their missiles. Kennedy helped us dodge the bullet. Now, it wasn't that Kennedy got smarter. He worked to overcome his biases. If a devil's advocate makes it even 1% less likely that there was a war, then we can all be very grateful for that devil's advocate and for Kennedy's efforts to get closer to the truth. So the next time you get mad at that jerk in your group who keeps questioning everything, know that they may have helped avoid a nuclear war.